The rain came down like bullets on the corrugated metal roof of the outpost, each drop hammering out a rhythm that spoke of violence rather than cleansing. Thomas Garrett pressed his back against the wall of the supply depot, watching the storm turn the red dust of Kepler 442b into rivers of rust-colored mud that snaked between the prefabricated buildings. He'd been stationed on this mining colony for 8 months, long enough to know that the storms here didn't mess around. They came hard, fast, and with enough electromagnetic interference to knock out communications for hours. He was supposed to be checking inventory, making sure the shipment manifest matched what had actually arrived on the last cargo hauler. Instead, he found himself staring out at the deluge, thinking about Earth, about real rain that smelled like petrichor instead of oxidized minerals. The thunder cracked overhead, and somewhere in the distance, he heard the groan of stressed metal, one of the older structures taking a beating. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A cry. High-pitched, terrified, barely audible over the roar of wind and rain. Thomas pushed away from the wall, his hand instinctively going to the emergency comm unit on his belt, even though he knew it would be useless in this interference. The cry came again, and this time he could place the direction, somewhere near the eastern perimeter, where the colony bordered the untamed wilderness of purple-black vegetation that the xenobotanists were always warning people to stay away from. He grabbed his rain slicker from the hook by the door and pushed out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical force, trying to shove him back inside, but Thomas lowered his head and pushed forward. Water streamed down his face, blurring his vision, but he kept moving toward that sound. The eastern perimeter was marked by a chain-link fence that looked laughably inadequate against the alien landscape beyond it. Thomas had walked this section 100 times during his patrols, knew every post and support strut. What he didn't know was how a small figure had ended up huddled against the fence, partially buried in mud and debris. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, the lightning painting shadows that looked almost solid. Then the figure moved, and Thomas realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he was looking at something alive, something small, something that shouldn't be there. He ran forward, dropping to his knees in the mud beside the creature. It was roughly the size of a human 3-year-old, but that's where the similarities ended. Its skin was a deep azure blue, almost luminescent in the flashes of lightning, covered in what looked like fine scales that shimmered when they caught the light. It had 4 arms, each ending in delicate 3-fingered hands that were currently wrapped around its own torso in a gesture of pure terror. Its eyes, large and golden with vertical pupils, locked onto Thomas's face, and another cry escaped from its small mouth, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "Hey, it's okay," Thomas said, knowing the words were meaningless, but hoping the tone would translate. He reached out slowly, carefully, the way you'd approach a frightened animal. "You're okay. I've got you." The child, and it was definitely a child, despite the alien features, flinched away from his touch, pressing harder against the fence. Its breathing was rapid, shallow, and Thomas could see its whole body trembling. One of its lower arms hung at an odd angle, possibly broken or dislocated. Thomas looked around, trying to spot any sign of adults, any indication of where this child had come from. The colony had a few alien residents, mostly contract workers and merchants, but he'd never seen anyone of this species before. The nearest settlement was over 50 kilometers away, and the storm would have made travel impossible for hours. Another crack of thunder, this one so close it felt like it rattled his bones, and the child let out a shriek of pure panic. Without thinking, Thomas pulled off his rain slicker and wrapped it around the small body, sheltering it from the worst of the downpour. The child's eyes went wide with surprise, but it didn't pull away this time. "Come on, little one," Thomas said, sliding his arms under the child's body as gently as he could. "Let's get you somewhere dry." The moment he lifted the child, it latched onto him with its 3 good arms, those sharp claws digging into his shirt, but not quite breaking skin. Thomas could feel the rapid flutter of its heart, or hearts, he had no idea what the internal anatomy was like, and adjusted his grip to support the injured arm. The child buried its face against his chest, the rain slicker creating a small pocket of relative warmth between them. Getting back to the depot was harder with the child in his arms. The wind seemed to have doubled in strength, and the mud sucked at his boots with every step. Twice he nearly lost his footing, and each time the child's grip tightened, those golden eyes flashing up at him in renewed fear. But Thomas kept his footing, kept moving forward, murmuring meaningless reassurances that seemed to help anyway. Inside the depot, he kicked the door shut behind them and stood for a moment, dripping water all over the floor, feeling the child's trembling slowly begin to subside. The overhead lights flickered, the storm playing havoc with the power systems, but they held steady. Thomas carried the child over to the break area, where there was a battered couch that had seen better days. He settled onto the couch carefully, keeping the child in his lap, unwilling to put it down until it seemed ready. Up close, in the better light, he could see more details. The scales weren't uniform. They formed intricate patterns across the child's skin, almost like tattoos but natural, organic. There were small ridges along its skull, where hair might have been on a human child, and when it opened its mouth to breathe, he could see that the teeth, while sharp, were arranged in a way that suggested an omnivorous diet. "Let's see that arm," Thomas said softly, reaching for the injured limb with the same care he'd use handling explosives. The child watched him with those enormous golden eyes, but didn't pull away. When his fingers probed gently at the joint, the child winced but made no sound. Dislocated, Thomas decided, not broken. He'd seen enough injuries in his 5 years of colonial work to recognize the difference. The child spoke then, a string of sounds that Thomas had no hope of understanding. The language was melodic, almost musical, with harmonics that made him think of wind chimes and running water. It was also clearly a question, repeated twice, with increasing urgency. "I don't understand," Thomas admitted, wishing for the first time that the colony had invested in better translation equipment. "But you're safe now. That's what matters." He stood carefully, keeping the child secure in his arms, and moved to the medical locker mounted on the wall. Colonial regulations required every building to have basic first aid supplies, and while they weren't designed for alien physiology, the principles should be similar enough. He pulled out a thermal blanket, the kind that could regulate temperature automatically, and wrapped it around the child, replacing his soaked rain slicker. The child seemed fascinated by the blanket, touching it with its good hands, watching the way the material shifted from silver to a warm bronze as it detected and responded to body heat. A small sound escaped it, not quite a laugh, but something close, something that spoke of wonder rather than fear. Thomas felt something in his chest loosen. Whatever this child was, wherever it had come from, it was still just a kid. Scared, hurt, alone in a storm. And he'd spent enough time around the colony's small population of human children, the miners' kids, mostly, to know that the fundamentals of caring for a frightened child probably transcended species. He found a bottle of water and offered it to the child, who sniffed it suspiciously before taking a small sip. The golden eyes widened again, and the child drank more eagerly. Thomas smiled, then rummaged through his personal locker until he found the emergency ration bars he kept stashed there. They tasted like cardboard mixed with sawdust, but they were nutritionally complete and supposedly safe for most carbon-based life forms. The child took the bar with its upper hands, examining it carefully before taking a tentative bite. Its face scrunched up in an expression that Thomas recognized even across species lines: disgust. But the child was clearly hungry because it kept eating anyway, washing down each bite with more water. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the depot, an odd sort of calm had settled over them. Thomas sat back down on the couch, and the child immediately curled up against him, still wrapped in the thermal blanket, still holding what remained of the ration bar. The injured arm was tucked close to its body, and Thomas made a mental note to try to set it properly once the child seemed more settled. He found himself studying the patterns on the child's skin, the way they seemed to shimmer and shift in the light. There was a logic to them, a symmetry that suggested they might be more than just decoration. Clan markings, maybe? Or something that indicated family lineage. He had no way of knowing, and the communications blackout meant he couldn't even try to research it. The child's breathing had evened out, the rapid, shallow gasps replaced by something deeper, more relaxed. One of its hands, small, delicate, tipped with those sharp little claws, rested against Thomas's chest, right over his heart. Every few seconds, those golden eyes would flick up to his face, as if checking to make sure he was still there, still safe. "Where did you come from?" Thomas asked quietly, not expecting an answer. "And where are your parents?" The child responded with another string of melodic sounds, slower this time, almost sleepy. Then it did something that made Thomas's throat tighten. It patted his chest with one small hand, a gesture so achingly familiar, so universal, that he felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a physical thing. This child trusted him, had chosen to trust him despite having every reason to be terrified of an unknown alien species. And Thomas knew, with the kind of certainty that came from the gut rather than the brain, that he couldn't let that trust be misplaced. He'd protect this child, figure out where it belonged, get it home safe. It seemed simple enough. He had no idea how wrong he was. The storm didn't break until well past midnight, the last rumbles of thunder fading into the distance like a retreating army. Thomas had dozed off at some point, his head tipped back against the couch, one arm wrapped protectively around the alien child who had fallen asleep against his chest. He woke to silence, the kind of profound quiet that only came after a storm had spent all its fury, and the soft glow of emergency lighting that had kicked in when the main power failed. The child was still sleeping, its breathing a soft whistle through those unusual nostrils. The injured arm had been carefully splintered using materials from the first aid kit, a process that had involved a lot of gentle coaxing and what Thomas hoped were soothing sounds. The child had been remarkably brave, only crying out once when he'd had to manipulate the joint back into place. Thomas carefully extracted himself from under the child, settling it onto the couch with the thermal blanket tucked around its small body. Those golden eyes flickered open briefly, found him, then closed again in what he chose to interpret as contentment, or at least acceptance. He moved to the window, looking out at the aftermath of the storm. The colony looked like it had been through a war. Debris scattered everywhere. One of the storage units had lost part of its roof, and the eastern fence, where he'd found the child, was partially collapsed. In the distance, he could see lights beginning to come on in other buildings as power was gradually restored. His comm unit crackled to life, making him jump. Static filled the air, then resolved into a voice he recognized, Station Chief Rodriguez. "All personnel report in. Repeat, all personnel report status. We've got structural damage across sectors 3 and 7, and..." More static, then clarity again. "Anyone missing, report immediately." Thomas grabbed the comm. "Garrett here. I'm at Supply Depot 7, Eastern Perimeter. I've got a situation that needs immediate attention." There was a pause, filled with the sound of what might have been Rodriguez cursing. "Define situation, Garrett. We've got our hands full with..." "I found a child during the storm, non-human, injured, no sign of any adults in the area." The silence that followed was longer this time. When Rodriguez spoke again, her voice had changed, taken on an edge of something Thomas couldn't quite identify. Concern. No, more than that. Something closer to alarm. "Describe the child." Thomas did, keeping his voice low so as not to wake his small charge. He detailed the blue scales, the golden eyes, the 4 arms, the patterns on the skin. As he spoke, he heard what sounded like rapid conversation on the other end, voices he didn't recognize speaking in urgent tones. "Garrett." Rodriguez's voice was sharp now, commanding. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not move that child. Do not let anyone else near it. We're sending a team to your location now. ETA 15 minutes. Chief, what's going on? Do you know what species?" "Just stay put, Garrett. That's an order." The comm went dead. Thomas stood there for a moment, staring at the silent device in his hand, then looked back at the child sleeping on the couch. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than he'd thought. The tone in Rodriguez's voice hadn't been the normal concern for an injured alien child. It had been the kind of tone you used when something had significant consequences, political consequences. He was still standing there, trying to puzzle it out, when he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Not just one, multiple engines, moving fast. Through the window, he watched as 3 ground transports pulled up outside the depot, disgorging what looked like half the colony's security force, along with several people he didn't recognize. The door burst open without preamble. Rodriguez came through first, her grey hair plastered to her head from the residual rain, her expression grim. Behind her came 2 guards he knew by sight, and 3 aliens he'd never seen before. These 3 moved with a fluid grace that marked them as either military or nobility, possibly both. They were tall, easily 7 feet, with skin that ranged from deep purple to almost black. Their eyes glowed with an inner light, shifting through colors like oil on water. They were also wearing what could only be described as battle armor, sleek and form-fitting, but clearly designed for protection. And they were armed. One of them, a female with skin the color of twilight and eyes that currently shone an alarmed gold, swept past Rodriguez and the guards as if they didn't exist. Her gaze locked onto the sleeping child, and a sound emerged from her throat that Thomas felt in his bones. Not a word, but something deeper, more primal. Recognition, relief, fear. She was across the room in 3 long strides, dropping to her knees beside the couch. Her hands, 4 of them, just like the child, hovered over the small body as if she was afraid to touch, afraid it might disappear if she made contact. Then, very gently, she scooped the child into her arms, cradling it against her chest. The child woke with a start, those golden eyes flying open, but the moment it saw who held it, it made a sound that needed no translation. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The reunion was brief, but intense. The tall alien woman, mother, Thomas's brain supplied, that had to be the mother, ran her hands over the child's body, checking for injuries with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of medical training. When she found the splintered arm, she looked up at Thomas for the first time, and the expression on her face made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger, though there was fury there. It wasn't gratitude, though he saw that too. It was something more complex, a mixture of emotions that he couldn't pass, but that made him feel suddenly, acutely aware that he was very much out of his depth. She spoke, her voice like music played on instruments Thomas had never heard. One of the other tall aliens, male, with skin like polished obsidian, stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, speaking quietly in the same melodic language. The woman listened, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face, then nodded once. Rodriguez cleared her throat. "Mr. Garrett, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Every detail, from the moment you first heard the child until we arrived." Thomas did, keeping his explanation concise and factual. He described finding the child by the fence, bringing it inside, treating its injuries as best he could. As he spoke, he noticed the 2 guards exchanging glances, and the 3 tall aliens listening with an intensity that made his skin prickle. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then the alien woman spoke again, and this time, a small device on her belt translated her words into flat, emotionless English. "You protected my daughter, kept her safe when she was lost and frightened, tended her wounds with care and skill." The translation didn't capture the nuances of her voice, but Thomas could hear them anyway, layered beneath the mechanical words. "For this, you have my gratitude and the gratitude of House Veltara. What you have done this night will not be forgotten." House Veltara. The name meant nothing to Thomas, but he saw Rodriguez go rigid, saw the guards suddenly look very uncomfortable. Whatever House Veltara was, it was significant enough to make experienced colonial personnel nervous. "I just did what anyone would do," Thomas said, which was true. She was scared and hurt. I couldn't just leave her there. The translation device worked both ways, because the woman tilted her head slightly, a gesture that Thomas was beginning to recognize as indicating surprise or confusion. "You say anyone, but my understanding of your species suggests this is not accurate." Many would have seen the differences between our kinds and chosen differently. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze. Maybe. But that's not how I was raised. A kid is a kid. Doesn't matter what they look like. Another exchange in that melodic language between the three aliens. The obsidian-skinned male stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice through the translator carried weight, authority. I am Lord Commander Calveth of House Veltara, Royal Guard to the Sovereign Throne of the Veltaran Collective. This is Lady Siriana, consort to the Sovereign Heir and mother to Princess Lyrakai. He gestured to the child, who was now watching Thomas with those huge golden eyes while clinging to her mother. The child you protected is fourth in line for the Sovereign Throne. She was taken during an assassination attempt on our diplomatic vessel. We have been searching for her for 14 of your hours. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Princess. Assassination attempt. Royal Guard. His brain tried to process what he was being told, tried to reconcile the terrified, hurt child he'd sheltered with the idea of interstellar royalty. I didn't know, he managed to say, which felt incredibly stupid, but was the only thing his shocked brain could produce. No, Lady Siriana said, and there was something in her voice that might have been approval. You did not know. You saw only a child in need and acted accordingly. There is honor in this. Rodriguez stepped forward, clearly trying to regain some control of the situation. Lord Commander, we had no notification of a diplomatic vessel in this sector. If we had known... Our presence was not publicized, Calveth interrupted, his tone making it clear that further explanation would not be forthcoming. The circumstances of our visit and the attack upon us are matters of collective security. What matters now is that the princess has been found, unharmed thanks to the actions of... He paused, looking at Thomas with those color-shifting eyes. I do not know your designation. Thomas Garrett, just a supply manager. Nothing special. Nothing special, Lady Siriana repeated, and the way she said it made it sound like she disagreed profoundly. She shifted her daughter slightly, and the child reached out with one small hand toward Thomas. He moved closer instinctively, and the princess's fingers wrapped around his larger hand, holding on with surprising strength. She spoke in that musical language, a rush of words that the translator didn't catch. Her mother listened, then nodded, something shifting in her expression. When she looked at Thomas again, there was a new quality to her gaze. Assessment, perhaps, or calculation. My daughter says you sang to her. Songs from your world. Is this true? Thomas felt his face heat. He had, in fact, sung a few children's songs during the long hours of the storm, old lullabies his grandmother had taught him. They'd seemed to help calm the princess when the thunder got particularly loud. Yes, she seemed to like it. She says your voice is kind, that you made her feel safe when she thought she would die. The mechanical translation couldn't hide the emotion now. She says you were brave, like the warriors in her lessons. I'm not a warrior, Thomas protested. I'm just a supply manager, Calveth finished. But there was something in his tone that suggested he found this as meaningful as his lady did. And yet you ventured into a storm that kept our trained soldiers grounded. You found a child you did not recognize and chose to protect rather than fear. You treated injuries to alien physiology without training or guidance. Perhaps you should reconsider your assessment of what is special, Thomas Garrett. The conversation that followed happened in fragments, interrupted by medical teams arriving to check on the princess, by urgent communications that the Veltaran contingent received on devices that glowed with symbols Thomas couldn't read, by Rodriguez trying to manage what was rapidly becoming a diplomatic incident of significant proportions. Through it all, Thomas found himself relegated to the sidelines, watching as his quiet little supply depot transformed into the center of what appeared to be very serious interstellar politics. The princess, Lyrakai, he reminded himself, she had a name, refused to let go of his hand for the first hour. Every time her mother tried to extract her, she'd make a sound of distress and hold on tighter. Finally, Lady Siriana stopped trying, instead settling onto the battered couch with her daughter in her lap and Thomas awkwardly half standing, half sitting beside them, while alien medics checked Lyrakai over with instruments that hummed and glowed. "The splint is well placed," one of the medics reported through a translator, sounding surprised. "The joint has been properly aligned. There is minimal additional damage from the reduction." "I watched a lot of medical training vids during my first posting," Thomas offered. "Never thought I'd use them like this, though." The medic, a stocky alien with 6 eyes arranged in a semicircle around its head, regarded him with what might have been respect. "You have natural talent. The princess's physiology is significantly different from yours, yet you adapted your technique appropriately." Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Lyrakai was watching the exchange with interest, her golden eyes tracking back and forth between Thomas and the medic. When the examination was complete and the medic stepped back, she tugged on Thomas's hand until he looked down at her. She spoke in that melodic language, a string of sounds that rose and fell like a complex melody. Her mother listened, then placed a hand on her daughter's head in a gesture that transcended species. Comfort, pride, love. "She wants to know if you will visit her on the Starship," Lady Siriana translated, without the device this time, her command of English clearly better than she'd initially let on. "She says you promised to tell her more stories about Earth." "I did," Thomas admitted. Between songs, he'd told Lyrakai about his home planet, about oceans and mountains, and the animals he'd grown up around. She'd listened with rapt attention, asking questions through gestures and expressions that he'd done his best to answer. "But I'm sure she'll be very busy once you're back on your ship. Important princess things." Lyrakai's response to this, even untranslated, was clearly a protest. Her mother smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her, and it transformed her face entirely, making her look younger and less intimidating, despite the fact that she could probably break him in half without trying. "Important princess things," Lady Siriana repeated, as if tasting the phrase. "My daughter is 4 cycles old, Thomas Garrett. Her important things currently consist of learning to read, arguing with her tutors about mathematics, and collecting stones she finds interesting. I think she can spare time for the one who saved her life." Before Thomas could respond to that, Lord Commander Calveth approached, his expression grave. "My lady, we need to discuss transport. The ship is ready for immediate departure, but there are complications." "What complications?" "The insurgents who attacked us are still at large. We've confirmed at least 3 vessels in the outer system, and while we disabled 2 during our initial engagement, there may be others. The safe route back to our primary fleet will take us through several high-risk sectors." He paused, those colour-shifting eyes moving to Thomas, then back to Lady Siriana. "The princess's safety is paramount. We cannot risk another attack." "Then we don't take the safe route," Lady Siriana said, her voice hardening into something that reminded Thomas she was consort to a throne heir and likely had her own military training. "We use the civilian corridors, blend in with merchant traffic." "Disguising a Veltaran diplomatic vessel will be difficult, my lady, and we still need to account for the possibility of tracking devices. The insurgents knew where we would be. They may still have means to follow us." The conversation continued, growing more technical, involving terminology and concepts that Thomas had no reference for. He tried to politely extract his hand from Lyrakai's grip, but she held on stubbornly, and her mother shot him a look that suggested he shouldn't push the issue. So he stood there, trying to make sense of what he was hearing, while also trying not to feel the weight of several alien gazes on him. Rodriguez appeared at his elbow, her voice low. "Garrett, you need to understand what's happening here. The Veltaran Collective is one of the major powers in this sector. We're talking about a civilization that controls over 300 settled worlds and has military capabilities that make the entire human colonial fleet look like toy boats. The fact that their princess was taken, that an assassination attempt was made, this could trigger a war. Over one child, over the implication that their royal family is vulnerable, over the message it sends to their allies and enemies." Rodriguez ran a hand through her still damp hair. "And now you're in the middle of it. You saved their princess, Garrett. That means something to them. It means a lot. I just helped a scared kid. I know. But they don't see it that way. To them, you performed an act of what they call soul honor, putting someone else's life above your own safety without expectation of reward. It's a big deal in their culture. Thomas absorbed this, watching as Lady Siriana and Lord Commander Calveth continued their intense discussion. So, what happens now? Now they take the princess back to their ship, they go home, and you get to say you met alien royalty. You'll probably get some kind of official commendation, maybe a reward of some sort. The Veltarans are big on formal gratitude. Rodriguez paused. Just be careful, Garrett. This level of attention from a major power can be complicated. Don't make promises you can't keep. As if summoning it with her words, Lady Siriana turned back to them, her expression thoughtful. Thomas Garrett, I have a proposal for you. Here it comes, Thomas thought. The reward, the formal thank you, the polite dismissal. Yes, my lady. Come with us. The depot went very, very quiet. Even the medics stopped what they were doing, turning to stare at Lady Siriana with expressions Thomas couldn't read, but which felt significant. I'm sorry. What? Come with us to the Starship, Lady Siriana repeated, her tone making it clear this wasn't a casual suggestion. My daughter has formed an attachment to you, and given what she has been through, I am reluctant to separate her from someone who makes her feel safe. Additionally, Lord Commander Calveth raises valid concerns about our journey home. Having a human aboard, someone from a neutral species with no political ties to our collective or our enemies, might provide useful cover. We could present ourselves as a merchant vessel with mixed crew. You want me to pretend to be a crew member on a royal starship. I want you to be a crew member on a royal starship, at least until we reach safe territory. After that, you would of course be free to return to your life here, with our gratitude and appropriate compensation for your time. Thomas looked at Rodriguez, who appeared to be working very hard to keep her expression neutral. Chief? It's your decision, Garrett. I can't order you to go with them, and I can't order you to stay. But I will say this. The Veltarans don't make offers like this lightly. If you refuse, they'll respect that. If you accept... She trailed off, clearly unsure how to finish that sentence. If you accept, Lord Commander Calveth said, speaking for the first time in several minutes, you will be under the protection of House Veltara for the duration of your service. You will be compensated at the rate of a royal guard for your time, and you will have the gratitude of a sovereign house, which is worth more than you might currently understand. Lyrakai tugged on Thomas's hand again, and when he looked down at her, those golden eyes were hopeful in a way that transcended language and species. She wanted him to come, wanted the safety and comfort of someone who had protected her when she was at her most vulnerable. And Thomas, who had signed up for colonial work because he liked the idea of being useful, of making a difference in small but meaningful ways, found himself thinking about a scared child in a storm and the promise he'd made to himself to keep her safe. How long would this take? He asked. Getting to safe territory? 3 weeks, perhaps 4 if we need to take circuitous routes, Lady Siriana said. We would ensure you will return to this location or any other destination you preferred once the journey was complete. 3 weeks, a month at most. He had vacation time saved up, hadn't taken a real break in over a year, and Rodriguez was already nodding slightly, a signal that she'd handle the administrative side of things if he decided to go. Okay, Thomas heard himself say. I'll do it. The reaction was immediate. Lyrakai made a sound of pure delight, her 4 arms wrapping around Thomas's arm in a hug that was surprisingly strong. Lady Siriana's expression shifted into something that might have been relief or approval, possibly both. Lord Commander Calveth nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry weight beyond the simple movement. Then it is decided, Calveth said. We depart within the hour. Thomas Garrett, you have time to gather any personal items you wish to bring. We will provide everything else you might need. The next hour passed in a blur. Thomas packed a small bag, changes of clothes, his tablet loaded with books and music, a few personal items that he couldn't quite articulate why he needed, but grabbed anyway. Rodriguez pulled him aside to make him sign what felt like 100 different forms, legal releases, and waivers that would protect both him and the colony from any complications arising from his temporary reassignment to diplomatic service. "You're sure about this?" she asked, as he scrawled his signature on the last document. "No," Thomas admitted. "But I don't think I could live with myself if I said no and something happened to that kid." Rodriguez smiled, a rare expression that made her look almost maternal. "You're a good person, Garrett. Try not to get lost in space, okay? I'd hate to do the paperwork for that." The transport to the Starship was unlike anything Thomas had experienced. The Veltaran vessel was positioned in orbit, invisible to normal sensors, but revealed as they approached in a heavily shielded shuttle. It was massive, easily 5 times the size of the largest human colony ship Thomas had ever seen, and its design was organic, almost flowing, like something that had been grown rather than built. Lyra Kai had insisted on sitting next to him during the flight, chattering away in her language while her mother translated bits and pieces. She was excited to show him her room, her toys, her collection of interesting stones. She wanted to introduce him to her tutors, her guards, her father. Thomas's brain stuttered on that last one. Her father is on the ship? "The Sovereign Heir is currently with the primary fleet, overseeing our defensive operations," Lady Siriana explained. "But he has been informed of what has happened, and he is eager to meet the one who protected his daughter." Eager to meet. The ruler of over 300 worlds wanted to meet Thomas Garrett, supply manager from Earth. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. The Starship's interior was as impressive as its exterior. Everything seemed to glow with soft light that had no apparent source, and the corridors were wide enough to accommodate the tall Veltarans with room to spare. Crew members stopped and stared as they passed, not at Lady Siriana or Lord Commander Calveth, but at Thomas, a human walking freely through their royal vessel, hand in hand with the princess. They were taken to what Calveth called guest quarters, though the rooms were larger and more luxurious than any accommodation Thomas had ever experienced. There was a sleeping platform that adjusted to his body, a viewing screen that showed the stars outside, and a small room that seemed to be a combination bathroom and cleaning station, with controls he didn't understand, but which responded to his touch with surprising intuition. "Rest," Lady Siriana instructed. "We will begin our journey once all security protocols are complete. Someone will come for you when it is time for the evening meal. You will dine with us, a formal thank you for what you have done." "I don't have formal clothes," Thomas protested, looking down at his practical work clothes. "That will be addressed." Lady Siriana moved toward the door, gently extracting her daughter from Thomas's side, despite Lyra Kai's protests. "For now, rest. You have been through much, and there is more to come." They left, the door sliding shut behind them with a soft hiss that spoke of sophisticated seals and security measures. Thomas stood in the center of his new quarters, his small bag of belongings looking pathetically inadequate against the alien luxury surrounding him, and tried to process what had just happened. 24 hours ago, he'd been doing inventory in a supply depot. Now he was on a royal starship, heading into potentially dangerous space, with a princess who considered him some kind of hero. Thomas must have dozed off despite his intention to stay awake and alert, because he woke to a soft chime that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room had dimmed while he slept, the ambient light fading to a gentle twilight that was surprisingly soothing. As he sat up on the sleeping platform, which had indeed adjusted perfectly to his body, leaving him more rested than he'd been in months, another chime sounded, and a section of the wall shimmered and became transparent, revealing a Veltaran standing in the corridor beyond. Not someone he recognized. This one was smaller than Calveth or Siriana, with skin that shaded from pale blue to silver depending on how the light caught it. Their eyes, currently a soft green, regarded Thomas with polite curiosity. "Thomas Garrett," the Veltaran said in perfect, unaccented English. "I am Miranel, attendant to the royal household. I have been assigned to assist you during your time aboard the Sovereign's Grace. May I enter?" Thomas stood, running a hand through his hair and trying to look more presentable than he felt. Sure, yeah, come in. The wall solidified again as Miranelle entered, carrying what looked like a bundle of fabric in their forearms. They moved with a grace that made Thomas feel clumsy by comparison, setting the bundle down on a nearby surface that rose from the floor to accommodate it. These are for you, Miranelle explained. Traditional garments for one honored by House Veltara. They have been adjusted to fit human proportions, and I am here to assist if you need help with the fastenings. Thomas approached the bundle, unfolding it to reveal clothing that was somehow both simple and elegant. The fabric was like nothing he'd ever touched. It had weight, but also moved like water, and the color shifted subtly from deep blue to silver as he held it up to the light. There was a long tunic-like garment, pants that looked comfortable despite their formal appearance, and a sash that was decorated with symbols he didn't recognize. The symbols, Miranelle said, noticing his attention, indicate your status as protector guest of the princess. They will be recognized by all Veltarans and afford you certain privileges while aboard this vessel. What kind of privileges? Free movement throughout most of the ship, access to our libraries and recreational facilities, the right to speak directly to senior crew members without formal petition, and most significantly, the protection of House Veltara against any who would wish you harm. Miranelle's eyes shifted to a warm gold. These are not small things, Thomas Garrett. You should understand that what you have been given is rarely bestowed on those outside our collective. Thomas swallowed, feeling the weight of that responsibility settling over him again. I really just helped a kid. I keep saying this, but I don't think anyone's listening. We are listening, Miranelle said gently. We simply understand better than you what your actions mean within our culture. The fact that you did this just to help, without knowledge of who she was or what you might gain, that is precisely why it matters so much. They gestured to the clothing. Now, shall I help you dress? The evening meal will begin in 1/2 turn, and it would not do to be late. Getting into the formal wear turned out to be more complicated than Thomas had anticipated. The tunic had fastenings that required a specific sequence to engage properly, and the sash needed to be wrapped in a particular way that Miranelle explained carried meaning. The pattern indicated not just his status, but also his willingness to learn Veltaran customs. Finally dressed, Thomas caught his reflection in a wall panel that Miranelle activated, and barely recognized himself. He looked like someone who belonged on a royal starship, someone important. It made him profoundly uncomfortable. You wear it well, Miranelle observed. Come, I will escort you to the dining hall. The walk through the ship gave Thomas his first real opportunity to see the vessel he was now aboard. The corridors were more than just hallways. They were living spaces, with alcoves that held what might have been art or possibly religious icons, with viewing ports that showed the stars streaming past as the ship moved through space at speeds Thomas couldn't begin to calculate. They passed dozens of crew members, and each one stopped what they were doing to observe him, their eyes shifting through various colors that he was beginning to suspect indicated emotional states or social signals. The dining hall was enormous, easily capable of seating hundreds, but tonight it held only a single long table set up near massive windows that offered an unobstructed view of space. Around the table sat perhaps 20 Veltarans, and as Thomas entered with Miranelle, they all turned to look at him. At the head of the table sat Lady Siriana, looking even more impressive in formal robes that seemed to capture and reflect the starlight. Beside her was Lyrakai, practically vibrating with excitement in a smaller version of her mother's formal wear. The princess saw Thomas and immediately waved all 4 arms in a gesture that needed no translation. Pure, uncomplicated joy at his arrival. Lord Commander Calveth sat to Siriana's left, and next to him was a Veltaran. Thomas hadn't met before, but whose bearing and the deference shown to him by others made his status clear. This one's skin was deep purple, shot through with veins of gold that pulsed with what might have been bioluminescence, and his eyes held steady at a deep crimson that Thomas instinctively understood meant authority. Thomas Garrett, Miranelle announced formally, and Thomas resisted the urge to laugh at the absurdity of being announced like nobility. Protector guest of Princess Lyrakai, honored by House Veltara. Come, sit, Lady Siriana said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. We are pleased you could join us. Thomas made his way to the indicated seat, hyper-aware of every eye on him. As he sat, Lyra Kai leaned across the table toward him, speaking rapidly in her language. Her mother translated with obvious amusement. My daughter says you look like a proper guardian now. She is very pleased with your appearance. Thank you, Princess, Thomas said, addressing Lyra Kai directly. You look very beautiful too. The princess beamed, then launched into another stream of words. This time, it was the purple-skinned Veltaran who responded, his voice deep and resonant, carrying harmonics that made Thomas think of organ music in cathedrals. When he finished speaking to Lyra Kai, he turned those crimson eyes on Thomas. I am Admiral Treshikor, Fleet Commander of the Sovereign's Grace and her escort vessels. Lady Siriana has told me of your actions on the surface. On behalf of the crew and warriors under my command, I extend our gratitude. The princess's safety is our highest duty, and you succeeded where we failed. The weight of that statement hung in the air. These were trained military personnel, elite warriors, and they were thanking a human supply manager for doing what they hadn't been able to do. Thomas chose his words carefully. You were dealing with an organized attack on multiple fronts. I was just in the right place at the right time. If anything, I'm glad I could help fill in the gap your attackers created. Admiral Treshikor's eyes shifted slightly, to a color that might have been approval or respect. Graciously said, You have wisdom to go with your courage, Thomas Garrett. These are valuable traits. The meal began then, servers appearing with dishes that ranged from the familiar to the completely alien. Thomas had been worried about dietary compatibility, but Miranelle leaned close to quietly identify which items were safe for human consumption. There was a grain-based dish similar to rice, but with a slightly sweet flavor, vegetables that looked like purple asparagus, but tasted like roasted nuts, and a protein that had been carefully prepared to match human digestive requirements. As they ate, conversation flowed around the table in that melodic language, occasionally switching to English when someone wanted to include Thomas directly. He learned that the attack on their diplomatic vessel had been coordinated by a faction opposed to Veltaran expansion into certain disputed sectors. The insurgents had somehow obtained codes that allowed them to track the ship's movements, which was how they'd known where to strike. The princess had been taken by a small infiltration team who had intended to use her as leverage in political negotiations, or possibly as a demonstration that even the royal family wasn't safe. We disabled their primary vessel and killed most of the infiltration team, Lord Commander Calveth explained, his tone matter-of-fact about violence. But one escaped with the princess in an emergency pod. We tracked them to the surface of your colony's planet, but the storm created interference that prevented us from pinpointing their exact location. By the time we narrowed down the search grid, you had already found her. What happened to the one who took her? Thomas asked, then immediately wondered if he wanted to know the answer. Dead, Calveth said simply. We found the body approximately 1 kilometer from where you discovered the princess. It appears they were attempting to reach a secondary extraction point when lightning struck nearby. The electromagnetic pulse disrupted their equipment, and they were caught in a flash flood. The princess managed to escape before the insurgent was swept away. Thomas remembered the terror in Lyra Kai's eyes, the way she'd been huddled against that fence, injured and alone. She'd been running from a dead captor, lost in a storm on an alien world, with no idea if rescue would come. The fact that she'd survived at all was remarkable. The fact that she'd remained calm enough to seek shelter rather than panicking spoke to training or natural resilience that was impressive in someone so young. She is brave, Thomas said, looking at Lyra Kai, who was carefully eating something that looked like blue gelatin. Braver than most adults would be in that situation. She is of royal blood, Lady Siriana said, but there was pride in her voice rather than arrogance. We train our children from birth to face adversity with strength, but even so, she is only 4 cycles old. To endure what she endured, alone and hurt. She paused, her eyes shifting to a color Thomas hadn't seen before, something between blue and silver. When she speaks of you, she says you made her feel like the storm couldn't hurt her anymore, like she was safe for the first time since the attack. For a mother, hearing this about a stranger who owed us nothing, it is a gift beyond price. Thomas didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and took another bite of his food. Across the table, Lyrakai was watching him with those huge golden eyes, and when she caught him looking, she smiled, an expression so similar to a human child's smile that it made his chest ache with familiar affection. The conversation shifted to other topics: the ship's trajectory, reports from other vessels in their fleet, political developments in sectors Thomas had never heard of. He listened more than he spoke, trying to absorb as much as he could about the culture and politics he'd suddenly found himself immersed in. The Veltarans were clearly a sophisticated civilization, with complex social hierarchies and intricate protocols, but they were also, he was beginning to realize, fundamentally pragmatic. They valued results over rhetoric, action over empty promises. It reminded him, oddly, of the colonial mindset, the understanding that in harsh environments, what mattered was what you could actually do, not what you claimed you could do. As the meal wound down, Admiral Treshikor stood, raising a crystal cup filled with liquid that shimmered like captured starlight. The table fell silent. "A toast," the Admiral said, his voice filling the hall. "To Thomas Garrett, who exemplifies the highest ideals of honor, regardless of species or circumstance. May House Veltara never forget what was done for our princess, and may our gratitude be as enduring as the stars themselves." The Veltarans around the table stood as one, raising their own cups. Thomas scrambled to stand, feeling awkward and overwhelmed, but when he raised his cup, not knowing what else to do, the assembled aliens drank deeply, their eyes all shifting to that warm gold color he was beginning to associate with approval and respect. Lyrakai, who had a smaller cup of what was probably juice rather than alcohol, raised hers too and drank with solemn importance. Then she set down her cup and spoke in her language, her voice clear and firm despite her young age. Lady Siriana translated, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "My daughter wishes to add her own toast. She says, to Thomas, who is the bravest human and the best friend a princess could ask for during a scary storm. May he always know he is welcome in our house and our hearts." The simplicity of it, the pure childlike sincerity, hit Thomas harder than any formal declaration could have. He looked at Lyrakai, at this small alien child who had chosen to trust him in her darkest moment, and felt something shift in his chest. A connection that transcended species and culture, and every rational reason he could think of. "Thank you, Princess," he managed to say. "That means more than you know." The evening concluded with what Miranel explained was a traditional ceremony of gratitude. Thomas was presented with a small medallion, no bigger than his thumbnail, made of metal that seemed to contain its own light source. The symbols etched into it matched those on his sash, but these, Miranel explained, were permanent. "This marks you as one who has earned the personal gratitude of the royal family," Miranel said, as they fastened it around Thomas's neck on a delicate chain that adjusted itself to fit comfortably. "It cannot be removed except by your own choice or your death. As long as you wear it, any Veltaran you encounter will know what you have done and will treat you accordingly." The first week aboard the Sovereign's Grace passed in a strange blur of routine and wonder. Thomas fell into a rhythm that felt simultaneously foreign and oddly comfortable. He woke to that soft chiming sound, ate breakfast in a smaller dining area with other crew members who were slowly growing accustomed to his presence, and spent his mornings exploring the parts of the ship he was allowed to access. The libraries alone could have occupied him for months. They contained not just Veltaran texts and historical records, but collections from dozens of other species, a repository of knowledge that made Earth's greatest archives look like pamphlets. Thomas found himself drawn to the sections on xenobiology and cultural anthropology, trying to understand the civilization he'd found himself embedded in. The afternoons, however, belonged to Lyrakai. The princess had recovered quickly from her physical injuries, but her mother had noticed what Lady Siriana described as shadow reactions, moments where sudden noises made Lyrakai freeze, times when she seemed to withdraw into herself without apparent cause. The ship's medical staff recognized these as trauma responses, and one of their recommendations had been to maintain connection with the source of safety she'd found during her ordeal, which meant Thomas spent several hours each day with a 4-cycle-old alien princess who had decided he was her new favorite person. It was exhausting. It was also, he had to admit, kind of wonderful. Lyrakai was brilliant in the way young children often were, picking up concepts and languages with a speed that left Thomas struggling to keep up. She'd already begun learning English, and their lessons had become a two-way exchange. She taught him basic Veltaran words and phrases. He helped her with English pronunciation and grammar. Her tutors, a trio of elderly Veltarans with skin so dark it was almost black, and eyes that had settled into a permanent scholarly amber, seemed both amused and impressed by the arrangement. "She learns faster with you than she has with any of us," one of them, Scholar Catherine, observed during their third session together. "There is something about your teaching method that resonates with her thought patterns." Thomas, who had been helping Lyrakai understand the concept of metaphor by comparing stars to diamonds scattered on dark cloth, shrugged. "I'm not really a teacher. I'm just talking to her like she's smart enough to understand, because she is." "Precisely," Catherine said, their eyes shifting to a pleased gold. "You do not simplify for her age, you simplify for her understanding. It is a distinction our species often fails to make with our young." The comment stayed with Thomas through the rest of the day. That evening, as he sat in his quarters, trying to read a Veltaran text that Miranel had helped him access, something about ancient trade routes, which was more interesting than it sounded, a chime announced a visitor. It was Lord Commander Calveth, still in what Thomas had learned was light combat armor, though the weapons had been removed or powered down. "May I speak with you?" Calveth asked, his formality suggesting this was something official rather than casual. "Of course." Thomas set aside his tablet and gestured to the seating area. "Is something wrong?" "On the contrary, something is remarkably right, and it is creating an unexpected problem." Calveth settled into a seat that adjusted to accommodate his larger frame, his forearms finding comfortable positions with practiced ease. "The princess has not had a shadow reaction in 3 days. Her sleep patterns have normalized. She is eating properly again and engaging with her studies with enthusiasm we have not seen since before the attack." "That's good, right?" "It is excellent. However, it has created a discussion within the royal household about what happens when we reach our destination and you return to your colony." Calveth's eyes shifted to a troubled blue-green. "Lady Siriana is concerned that separating Lyrakai from you at this point in her recovery could cause regression. The medical staff concurs with this assessment." Thomas felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. "You want me to stay longer than the original agreement?" "We want to offer you a choice, Thomas Garrett. Not as a favor to us, though it would be one, but as a genuine opportunity that you should consider based on your own interests and desires." Calveth leaned forward, his expression intense. "What do you know about the Veltaran education system?" The question caught Thomas off guard. Just what I've picked up this week. You start training young, focus on both intellectual and practical skills, emphasize honor and duty. Why? Because our system, while effective at producing competent adults, has a weakness we have long recognized but struggled to address. We are excellent at teaching facts, at drilling techniques, at instilling discipline. We are less effective at fostering creativity, at encouraging the kind of lateral thinking that allows individuals to adapt to truly novel situations. Calveth's eyes shifted to gold. "In the past week, you have demonstrated teaching methods that Scholar Catherine believes could address this weakness. The way you help Lyrakai connect concepts, the way you encourage her to question and explore rather than simply memorize. These are approaches we could benefit from systemically. You want me to teach other Veltaran children? I want to offer you a position as cultural liaison and educational consultant to the Royal Academy. You would work with our scholars to develop new teaching protocols, incorporating human educational philosophy with our existing systems. You would teach a small group of students, including the princess, using your methods, demonstrating their effectiveness, and you would be compensated at a rate that would make your current salary look like pocket change. Thomas sat back, his mind reeling. For how long? Initially, a contract of 1 solar cycle, approximately 2 of your Earth years. At the end of that period, both parties would evaluate whether to continue the arrangement. Calveth paused. You would have private quarters in the royal district of our homeworld's capital. You would have access to resources most humans never see. You would be teaching the children of our most prominent families, shaping the next generation of Veltaran leadership. And I could return to Earth whenever I wanted. Within reason, yes. You would be expected to fulfill your teaching commitments, but we would arrange for regular leave periods. We could even sponsor Earth visitation for you, which would bypass many of the bureaucratic complications your species currently faces for off-world travel. It was an incredible offer, life-changing, the kind of opportunity that people spent their entire careers hoping for. And yet Thomas found himself hesitating, and it took him a moment to understand why. What does Lyrakai want? He asked. Have you asked her? Calveth's eyes shifted to something Thomas hadn't seen before, a soft, warm color that might have been respect or possibly affection. We have. She wants you to stay, but she is 4 cycles old, and while her opinion matters, the decision cannot rest solely with her. This offer is being made because we genuinely believe you could benefit our educational system, Thomas Garrett. The fact that it also keeps you near the princess is secondary. Can I think about it? You have until we reach the outer marker of our territory, which will be approximately 10 more days at current speed. At that point, we will need to make arrangements either for your return journey or for your integration into our society. Calveth stood, and Thomas automatically rose with him. Whatever you decide, know that you have already given House Veltara more than we could repay. This is an opportunity, not an obligation. After Calveth left, Thomas sat in silence for a long time, staring out at the stars streaming past his window. 2 years, teaching alien children, living on a world he'd never seen, immersed in a culture he barely understood. It was insane. It was impossible. It was also, he realized with growing certainty, exactly the kind of challenge he'd been looking for when he'd signed up for colonial work in the first place. The chance to do something that mattered, something that couldn't be done by anyone else in quite the same way. He thought about Lyrakai, about the way her eyes lit up when she mastered a new concept, about Scholar Kethrin's observation that his teaching methods resonated with her thought patterns, about the possibility that he could help shape how an entire civilization approached education. And he thought about his little supply depot on Kepler 442b, about the routine comfort of inventory checks and shipment manifests, about the quiet predictability of a life where the biggest excitement was usually a particularly bad storm. The choice, when he really examined it, wasn't that difficult. The next morning, he asked Miranel to arrange a meeting with Lady Siriana. When he was shown into her private chambers, a space that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, with viewing windows that currently showed a planet they were passing, all swirls of green and blue atmosphere, she looked up from a datapad with an expression of polite curiosity. Thomas Garrett, I am pleased to see you. Please sit. He did, choosing his words carefully. Lord Commander Calveth spoke to me last night about a position at your Royal Academy. He did. I hope he made clear that this is a genuine offer of employment, not an attempt to keep you here out of some misplaced sense of obligation to the princess. He did, and I've thought about it. I have some questions before I can give you a final answer. Of course. Ask whatever you need to know. First, would I be allowed to maintain contact with Earth? I have family there, friends. I don't want to disappear from their lives for 2 years. Communication would be facilitated and encouraged. We have long-range communication arrays that can reach Earth with minimal delay. You could send messages as frequently as you wished, and we could arrange holographic calls on a regular schedule. Second, what happens if it doesn't work out? If I'm terrible at this, or if the other students don't respond to my teaching methods the way Lyrakai has? Lady Siriana's eyes shifted to an amused gold. Then we would evaluate the situation honestly and make adjustments. You would not be abandoned or punished for failing at something we asked you to attempt. The worst outcome would be a mutual agreement to end the contract early, with appropriate compensation for your time and effort. And third, Thomas hesitated, then pushed forward. Would I actually have the freedom to teach in my own way, or would I be expected to just fit into your existing system? We are asking you to challenge our existing system, Thomas Garrett. If we wanted someone to maintain the status quo, we would hire another Veltaran scholar. We want you specifically because you think differently, because you approach problems from a perspective we lack. You would have significant autonomy in how you structure your lessons, though of course we would ask that you collaborate with our scholars to ensure basic educational standards are met. Thomas took a deep breath. Then my answer is yes. I'll take the position. The transformation in Lady Siriana's expression was remarkable. Her eyes shifted to that warm gold, and what might have been a smile played at the corners of her mouth, an expression he was learning to recognize as genuine pleasure. The royal household will be most pleased, and I suspect my daughter will be overjoyed, though we should probably inform her formally rather than letting her hear through household gossip. She stood, and Thomas rose with her. Welcome to House Veltara, Thomas Garrett. I believe this will be the beginning of something significant. She was right, though neither of them could have known just how significant at the time. The remaining days of the journey were spent in preparation for Thomas's new role. Scholar Catherine and their colleagues provided him with materials on Veltaran child development, their educational philosophy, and the specific challenges they faced with their current systems. Thomas absorbed as much as he could, making notes and asking questions that the scholars seemed to find either insightful or amusingly naive, sometimes both. Lyra Kai, when informed that Thomas would be staying, had expressed her joy in the most direct way possible, by wrapping all 4 arms around him in a hug that nearly knocked him over and refusing to let go for a solid 5 minutes while her mother looked on with obvious affection. "You will teach me forever?" Lyra Kai asked in careful English, her pronunciation improving daily. "Not forever," Thomas corrected gently. "But for a while, yes. I'll teach you and other students too." "Other students are not as good as me," Lyra Kai declared with the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old, making her mother laugh, a sound like chimes in wind. "Other students will be different from you," Thomas said. "Not better or worse, just different. And part of learning is understanding how to work with people who are different from you." Lyra Kai considered this with the same serious expression she brought to all new concepts. "Like how you are different from me. Different skin, different number of arms. Exactly like that. And we get along just fine, don't we?" "We get along perfect," Lyra Kai agreed, then frowned slightly. "Perfectly. You are teaching me grammar." "I am. And you're learning it quickly." Thomas ruffled her head, a gesture she'd initially been confused by, but now seemed to enjoy. "Now go practice your mathematics with Scholar Catherine. I have adult things to discuss with your mother." The adult things turned out to be logistical details about his new position. Salary, astronomical, literally and figuratively, living arrangements, private quarters in what was apparently one of the most desirable districts of the Veltaran capital. Work schedule, flexible, with the understanding that teaching often required irregular hours, and most importantly, his status within the collective. "You will be granted what we call honored guest citizenship," Lady Siriana explained. "It is not full citizenship, that would require years of residency and cultural integration, but it affords you most of the same rights and protections. You will have freedom of movement, freedom of speech within reasonable bounds, and the protection of House Veltara should any situation arise where your status as an outsider creates complications." "What kind of complications?" "The Veltaran collective is vast and diverse. While most of our people will welcome you as a curiosity and honor you for what you did for the princess, there will be some who view any non-Veltaran with suspicion. There may be those who question whether a human should be teaching our children. You should be prepared for that resistance." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've dealt with prejudice before. It's not unique to any one species." "No," Lady Siriana agreed, her eyes shifting to a thoughtful amber. It is not, which is part of why your presence may be valuable beyond the educational context. You will be a living demonstration that competence and character are not bound by species. Some will learn from this, others will not. Such is the nature of change. The Sovereign's grace dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the 13th day, and Thomas got his first look at the Veltaran homeworld through the massive viewing windows in the observation deck. The planet was stunning, larger than Earth, with 3 moons that created complex tidal patterns visible even from orbit. The continents were a mix of deep purples and blues, vegetation that had evolved under a different star, creating landscapes that looked simultaneously alien and somehow familiar. The capital city, visible as they descended through the atmosphere in a smaller shuttle, was built in layers that climbed up the sides of what looked like ancient volcanic formations. Structures grew from the rock itself, organic and flowing, integrated with the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Lights glowed throughout the city, not the harsh white of human cities, but warmer tones that shifted through golds and ambers. "It's beautiful," Thomas said, and meant it. Beside him, Lyrakai pressed her face against the window, her earlier excitement at showing him her homeworld temporarily subdued by something that might have been anxiety. Her mother noticed and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You are safe, little one. The bad people cannot reach you here." "I know," Lyrakai said quietly. "But I remember being scared. I remember thinking I would never see home again." Thomas crouched down to her level, making eye contact with those golden eyes that were currently tinged with the blue-green of worry. "But you did see it again. You made it home because you were brave and strong. And now you get to show me all your favorite places, right?" The anxiety faded slightly, replaced by a tentative excitement. "I can show you the Crystal Gardens, and the teaching amphitheatre where the scholars give lessons, and the tower where Father works when he is home." "I would love to see all of those things," Thomas assured her, and watched as her eyes shifted back to their normal gold. The royal compound was even more impressive up close. It sprawled across one of the higher tiers of the city, with gardens that defied Thomas's understanding of botany, plants that glowed, that seemed to move in patterns that had nothing to do with wind, that created symphonies of colour and light as they grew. The architecture was both ancient and modern, traditional forms enhanced with technology that was so seamlessly integrated it was almost invisible. Thomas's quarters were in what Miranel explained was the Scholars' Wing, a section of the compound reserved for teachers, researchers, and advisors to the royal family. His rooms were spacious without being ostentatious, comfortable without being excessive. There was a workspace with advanced computing systems that Miranel promised to teach him how to use, a sleeping chamber with that same adjustable platform that had made the ship quarters so comfortable, and a balcony that overlooked the crystal gardens Lyrakai had mentioned. "This is too much," Thomas protested, looking around at accommodations that made his colony housing look like a storage closet. "This is appropriate for someone of your status," Miranel corrected gently. "You are an honoured guest of the royal family and an educator who will be shaping young minds that may one day lead our collective. The quarters reflect the importance of your role." Over the following weeks, Thomas began to settle into his new life. He met the other students who would be in his initial teaching group, a carefully selected mix of royal children and high-ranking family offspring who had been chosen both for their academic potential and their families' willingness to participate in what was essentially an educational experiment. They ranged in age from 3 cycles to 7, and they regarded their new human teacher with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. His first formal lesson was both terrifying and exhilarating. He'd decided to start with something simple, a discussion about problem-solving using a puzzle that had multiple valid solutions. The Veltaran educational approach typically emphasized finding the correct answer through logical analysis. Thomas wanted to show them that sometimes there were many correct answers, and the process of discovery could be as valuable as the final solution. The young Veltarans had been confused at first, then frustrated when he wouldn't simply tell them which solution was right. But slowly, cautiously, they began to experiment, to try different approaches, to build on each other's ideas, rather than competing to be first with the answer. Lyra Kai, who had already been exposed to Thomas's teaching methods, served as an inadvertent model for the others. She asked questions freely, admitted when she didn't understand something, and celebrated when her classmates found solutions she hadn't considered. By the end of the session, even the most skeptical students were engaged. Scholar Catherine, observing from the back of the room, had eyes that glowed with unmistakable approval. "Remarkable," the scholar said afterward. "In one session, you achieved more collaborative thinking than we typically see in a month of traditional instruction." "They're smart kids," Thomas replied. "They just needed permission to think outside the usual framework." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "But getting them to accept that permission, to trust in exploration over certainty, that is the difficult part. You made it seem natural." Word of the experimental teaching program spread through the royal compound and beyond. Thomas found himself receiving visits from other scholars, from curious parents, from government officials who wanted to understand what the human was doing that was creating such interest. He answered their questions as best he could, always emphasizing that he wasn't trying to replace Veltaran educational methods, just supplement them with different approaches. Not everyone was convinced. There were critics who argued that human teaching methods were too chaotic, too undisciplined, that they would produce students who questioned too much and followed established wisdom too little. Thomas didn't try to argue with these critics. Instead, he let the results speak for themselves. His students began to show improvements, not just in creativity, but in their ability to apply knowledge in novel contexts. They started asking deeper questions in their other classes. They became better at working in teams, at considering multiple perspectives before settling on an approach. And Lyra Kai, the princess who had been traumatized by kidnapping and terror, blossomed under the combined attention of her human teacher and her traditional scholars. The shadow reactions faded entirely. Her confidence grew. She became a leader among her peers, not because of her rank, but because of her genuine curiosity and her willingness to help others learn. 3 months into his contract, Thomas was invited to present his teaching methods to the Royal Academy's governing council. It was a formal affair, held in a chamber that reminded him of pictures he'd seen of Earth's most prestigious universities, with tier upon tier of seating occupied by some of the most educated beings in the Veltaran collective. He was nervous in a way he hadn't been since he'd found a scared alien child in a storm and had no idea what he was doing, but did it anyway. The presentation went well. He showed examples of student work, explained his pedagogical philosophy, and fielded questions that ranged from genuinely curious to clearly skeptical. When it was over, the council deliberated while Thomas waited in an antechamber with Miranelle, trying not to pace. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. The experimental program would be expanded. Thomas would take on additional students. Other teachers would be trained in his methods, adapting them to work within the Veltaran cultural context. He would be given a formal title, Master Educator of Cross-Species Pedagogy, and a seat on the Academy's advisory board. "Congratulations," Miranelle said, their eyes shining with pride. "You have achieved in 3 months what most educators spend lifetimes working toward." That evening, there was a small celebration in the royal family's private chambers. Nothing formal, just Lady Siriana, Lyra Kai, Lord Commander Calveth, and a few close household members. The sovereign heir was still with the fleet, but he'd sent a personal message of congratulation that Lady Siriana read aloud, her voice warm with spousal affection. Lyra Kai presented Thomas with a gift she'd made herself, a drawing showing a human and a small Veltaran standing together under a sky full of stars. The figures were holding hands, and there were words written in careful English at the bottom. "Thank you for teaching me that different is good." Thomas felt his throat tighten as he looked at the drawing, at this tangible evidence of what his decision to stay had meant. "This is beautiful, Princess. I'll treasure it." "I will make you more," Lyra Kai promised, "when I am better at drawing, and when I learn more words." "I'll treasure those too," Thomas assured her. Later, standing on his balcony and looking out at the alien city that was slowly becoming familiar, Thomas thought about the chain of events that had led him here. A storm, a scared child, a simple decision to help. And from that one moment of compassion, an entire life had changed. Not just his, but potentially the lives of every student he would teach, every educator who would learn from his methods, every Veltaran child who would grow up thinking that different perspectives were valuable rather than threatening. He thought about his grandmother, who had taught him those lullabies he'd sung to Lyrakai during the storm. She'd always said that you never knew how far the ripples would spread from one act of kindness. He'd thought it was just something adults said to make kids feel good about being nice. Turned out, she'd been absolutely right. His comm device chimed with an incoming message. It was Rodriguez, from the colony, his first personal message from her since he'd left. Garrett, I hope this finds you well in your fancy royal quarters. I wanted you to know that your replacement arrived last week. He's competent enough, but he doesn't sing to the inventory like you did. Yes, I knew about that. Everyone knew about that. The colony feels different without you here, but I'm glad you're where you are. You were always too interesting for this place. Take care of yourself out there, and don't forget about us normal folks who still count shipment manifests for a living. Rodriguez out. Thomas smiled, reading the message twice. Then he composed a response, telling her about his students, about the academy, about how strange and wonderful his new life was. He told her about Lyrakai's progress, about Scholar Catherine's enthusiasm for educational reform, about the way the alien sunset painted the crystal gardens in colours that Earth's sky had never imagined. He didn't tell her that he sometimes missed the simplicity of the supply depot, the uncomplicated rhythm of inventory and manifests. She probably knew anyway. As he finished the message and sent it off into the void between stars, Thomas heard a familiar chime at his door. Lyrakai, who had apparently escaped her bedtime routine, stood in the corridor with all four arms behind her back and an expression of determined innocence on her face. I cannot sleep, she announced in English that was now nearly fluent. I am thinking too much about tomorrow's lesson. Are you now? Thomas said, trying not to smile at the transparent excuse. Yes, I am thinking we should talk about the lesson, to help my brain stop thinking. Your mother knows you're here. Mother said I could visit for 10 minutes if you agreed. She is very wise about knowing when I will not sleep without seeing you first. Thomas stepped aside, letting the princess into his quarters. She immediately went to the balcony, looking out at the gardens with the kind of contentment that spoke of being home and safe. It is pretty, she said, but I think the stars from your planet must be prettier, because you are from there, and you are the best teacher. The stars are the same everywhere, princess. That's one of the wonderful things about them. Then I will go to Earth someday and see the same stars from a different place. That is science and also poetry, yes? Yes, Thomas agreed, joining her at the balcony railing. That's exactly what it is. They stood together in comfortable silence, a human and an alien child who had found each other in a storm and changed each other's lives in ways neither could have predicted. In the distance, the city glowed with its warm lights, and above, the stars shone with the same light that touched every world where beings looked up and wondered. Some beginnings, Thomas reflected, came from the most unexpected places, and some storms brought more than just rain. They brought opportunities to be brave, to be kind, and to discover that the most meaningful connections often had nothing to do with how many arms you had or what color your skin might be. They had everything to do with seeing a person in need and choosing to help. Everything else was just details.